Good morning, Mariann. How are you?
I'm great. Lovely to see you, Jamie.
You too. And it's wonderful to have the chance to turn the tables after I had the honor of appearing on Our Hen House, a proper big podcast that people actually listen to. So it's great to have you as a guest on my mini one.
I warned you right before we started that you have to stop being so self-deprecating about your podcast. It's great, it's growing, and it will soon be, everyone in the world will be listening to it.
Thank
I have no
you.
doubt.
My British self-deprecation is just an act. I'm really just fishing for, I'm just fishing for compliments. So thank you.
I have to tell you, that's occurred to me in the past.
You played perfectly into my plan.
Does he really think that, or is it just that he's British?
Yeah. But it's brilliant to have you join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And as you know already, it's really centered on, I think of as the two deepest, but also simplest philosophical questions: what's real and what matters morally? And I clearly have an overwhelming bias in that I think the right answer is summed up in this really simple worldview called Sentientism, which says when we're thinking about what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach that uses evidence and reason. And when we're thinking about what matters morally, we should grant compassion for all beings that are sentient, that can experience suffering and flourishing. But again, I'm talking to people in these conversations who agree and disagree. So it will be fascinating to hear your personal story. But before we get on to that, how would you best introduce your life and your work for the rare people that don't know what you do already?
Oh, yeah, there's so few left in the world.
Absolutely, your global fame.
Let's see. I'll just talk about my animal life. I didn't really wake up to animal issues until I was in my 40s. I always liked animals, but nothing really special. And I was living with a dog alone for the first time on a whim. I had adopted a dog, and literally on a whim. I was on my way to the law library, and I said to myself, if the ASPCA adoption truck is there, I am adopting a dog today. And it was there. It wasn't there that often. And you all already now know part of my worldview is that there's a lot of superstition in there. I'm not claiming to believe in it. Obviously, it ruins my life in many ways. So I adopted a dog. He almost died because he was so ill. He was adorable. I loved him totally. But I also started to notice that there's so much going on here. And it just, when you're living alone, I think that you really do key into things sometimes. You have a lot of time to think. And I just started thinking about animals more generally. First about dogs. Got very involved in training him and just spending time with him and getting to know him. And then about animals more broadly. A bartender I knew at a bar I used to hang out at, the Air Inn. If you're ever in New York, please go because it's a great bar. Happened to mention to me that he had stopped eating meat because of the way the animals were treated. And it was just like, boom. It was one of those moments in life. And I thought, oh yeah, that's probably a problem. I think probably, or maybe I just attribute my own thoughts to everybody, but I just think most people know there's a problem there. They just avoid thinking about it. And I was just open at that moment. And I started looking into it. I was a lawyer. I worked for myself, and then I worked at the court in Manhattan for many years. And so that was naturally the direction in which I gravitated as I gradually became more aware that this was a nightmare beyond incomprehensible dimensions. And what was one to do about it? And so I joined the Animal Law Committee of the New York City Bar Association. I was very lucky because it was the first bar association in the country to have an animal law committee, and several people had founded it before I joined it. So I was able to join that, find some like minds. But they weren't all like minds because I quickly became very involved in farm animal issues because that was where the nightmare was. And a lot of people were just interested in dogs and cats. But farm animals was catching on, even in the animal rights movement. This is back in the mid-90s. So it was so easy to forget, but it was so hard to find things out then. Like you couldn't just go online and find out what was happening. I ended up subscribing, and I would get mailings from different animal rights organizations. They would say different things. They all hated each other. Like it was craziness. But I did subscribe to The Animals Agenda, which was a magazine at the time published by Kim Stallwood, you're probably familiar with.
Previous guest, actually.
British activist. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And that was amazing. And I ended up being on his board. It was a not-for-profit. And that way I was able to get more information. And that's what you had to do. You had to read a magazine. It's a very depressing magazine. Like you didn't look forward to sitting down with it. But I was desperate for information. And so I guess it's too late to make a long story short, so I'll make it a little shorter. I just became involved in legal things. I've never practiced animal law. I just tried to find ways to make myself useful. We would comment on legislation. we wrote a report for the city that actually ended up being very influential in New York, setting up the way it handles sheltering. And a lot of the work then was still around dogs and cats. But I became a little bit more aware. One thing led to another. I wrote a few articles with David Wolfson and started teaching. And I've taught at a number of different law schools because I teach as an adjunct. I never joined the faculty. And just kept doing that. And then I met Jasmin. We founded our hen house. We started the podcast. That was basically the beginnings.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And we'll come back to a lot of those themes because I guess that sort of what matters morally question has been central to so much of your life, and I guess has driven a lot of your work and your focus. But it'd be good to start with the first of those two deep questions, the one about what's real. So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up in quite a naturalistic, agnostic, atheistic, science-minded context, or one that was more supernatural or religious or mystical in some way, and how their philosophy shifted on that, I guess, epistemological side of philosophy over time, if it has. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you're comfortable, but it would be interesting to know your story on.
It wouldn't be surprising to know, since my name is Mariann Sullivan, that I grew up Catholic. And we weren't a terribly religious family, but definitely faith was an important part of my life growing up. It was a very important part of my mother's life. I'm not sure about my father. He never spoke a lot. I take after my father. Keep it to myself a lot. But yeah. I didn't ever go to Catholic school, but I went to, they called it confraternity, like Catholic lessons, like twice a week for all of my childhood. I had faith. It was never a burden to me. I didn't, it wasn't, I guess Catholicism is pretty rigid, but it wasn't particularly rigid for me. I liked all the Virgin Mary and the saints. And I think having grown up religious, and I'm not really anymore, but you can never get those voices out of your head. You always think there's somebody out there. I don't know, maybe other people get over that, but for me, we all have so many different voices in our heads telling us to do this and then arguing with ourselves and having a lot of different opinions in there. But one of mine is always like the Virgin Mary, I think, somehow. Once they get in there, they can't get out. And I don't think it was ever a bad influence, but it did start to, when I was a teenager, it just started to seem unlikely. I didn't hate it, but I didn't see any reason why it would be true. Yep. It seemed like there were a lot of other options about what could be true. And the people who were teaching me, and I didn't have any horrible Catholic experiences. I know a lot of people do, but I didn't at all. Most of the people were very nice, but they didn't seem exceptionally bright or aware, so it was a long process, but I did just let go of thinking, this doesn't seem like the answer to all the questions that there are in the universe. And since then, I just never found all the answers. I just at some point decided, we're not here to understand what is happening. Either this is all there is, or maybe there's something else. I don't know, but it's not a puzzle I'll figure out in my life. So I thought and I think that's a good way for me to talk about it to people who are religious, because I just think that even if you believe, you shouldn't make things up, and you have not been given very much information about what it is that drives the universe. So maybe that's, even if there's somebody up there thinking you're supposed to do this, if they wanted you to know more, they would give you better facts.
And I think what you said there is just saying, I don't know, is probably one of the wisest things anyone can say. And we should get more comfortable with not knowing.
I'm glad I've started out the conversation with saying one of the wisest things that you've ever heard, even though it was like, I know nothing.
I think maybe that is
a pretty wise thing. Yeah.
And one of the themes through many of these conversations have been really about a journey away from a religious worldview to something that is either more naturalistic or, at least open-minded about what's going on and less certain. And it does seem like there's a correlation, because I think for people like you and me who had quite a positive religious culture and background, it was more about being kind to one another and compassion and just being a sort of intuitively good person. It wasn't structured and rigid, and the discrimination and harshness and constraints that can sometimes come through a religious worldview you didn't feel that. I didn't really feel that. So my journey was similar to yours, in that it was more originally about the logic and the evidence and just saying, look, this doesn't seem to altogether doesn't seem to make sense. There's some incoherencies, there's some inconsistencies. Yeah. I've just learned about all these 2,000 other religions and they can't all be right, and learning about scientific worldview. So it was more about the facts and the evidence. Whereas those of my guests who've frankly had in some cases, a truly horrific or at least a much tougher religious context, it was more, the trigger was more around some of the ethics and the morality that were part of that structure. So whether it was homophobia or the caste system or anti-Semitism or whatever it was, but it was something they saw in the ethics and the behavior and the practices that made them think, hold on, this isn't the right way to go. But it's interesting how there's a bit of a mix of those two rationales for moving away from a religious worldview that my guests have been sharing. Was there anything on that sort of ethics and morality side, or was it because your experiences were generally positive, there wasn't really anything on that side of the equation that pushed your drift?
I'm sure there were, but when I was younger, I probably wasn't very aware. I led a fairly sheltered life. I wasn't that aware of the horrors in the world. And I'm sure there were things that I thought were wrong. I'm sure there were.
Yeah.
But I just don't recall them.
Yeah. For some of those things, often they're, as with many of the problems in the world, when you're taught something is normal, you don't tend to recognize that there's a problem there until much later as well.
Exactly.
So, so I never asked the question, why are all the priests men? Or why are all the bishops men, for example? Or there were certain things that this is completely normal. It's only when you look back on it where you start to think, hold on, that doesn't hold together.
And when I did reach an age where I did start to question that, it was at the exact same time as I was questioning the whole Megillah. Yeah. It was both logically and at that point ethically mixed up as to why would I hold on to this worldview?
Yeah. And it sounds like your drift away from that was more of a sort of gentle drift. It wasn't intellectually or emotionally traumatic for you. It wasn't difficult with your family or your society. Is that fair to say?
As I said, I was like my father. I just didn't talk about it to my mother, who's I'm sure she figured it out at some point and her heart broke. But no, I didn't. And it was an interesting time. At the time, I went to college in 1968. Those were very tumultuous times, both socially and politically, and there was huge change going on. I went to a Catholic college, and I often tell this story. When I arrived, we had to dress for dinner, like in dresses and heels, and go to church every week. And by the time I left, there were like men with beards living in the dorms with most of the other students. It was a time of dramatic, almost incomprehensible.
You could see the shifts happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
It must have been amazing.
Especially the signs were there earlier in the 60s. I was a child and I was a little sheltered from it. And then boom, the entire world changed. So this was the exact same time I was going through questioning religion, but everybody was questioning everything. That was just the nature of the world. So that certainly blended into that story.
Yeah, thank you.
And I wouldn't say that I lean towards atheism. I just don't like to I don't like to be certain about these things because I do think there are many things that we don't understand about the world. And I do think this I feel very strongly about. The only thing I feel very strongly about being true is that we're connected to each other in ways that we just don't understand. There are connections there that are beyond us. And so I think that's interesting. I feel pretty certain of that. Yeah. But it could be just another naturalist part of the world, or it could be something else. And like I said, I decided at some point, I don't think it's my job to figure that out.
Yeah,
there's plenty of other work to do.
And I'm reasonably comfortable with the term atheist, but I like the definition that just says it's just the absence of a belief in a deity. It doesn't mean you're 100% sure there isn't one, because I think a good hallmark of a naturalistic way of thinking is that you're never 100% sure about anything, really. As soon as you're 100% sure of something, you're basically saying, I'm no longer open to evidence or reasoning. I'm done. Right? And that's just another form of dogma. So again, I think it's good to be open-minded and uncertain, even about potentially quite outlandish ideas. It should always, have a small level
kind of on the
I think so.
On the same page there.
Yeah. And one of the other things that's been interesting for me is that there is this sense for some people that many people with a religious or a supernatural worldview have this sort of rich sense of awe and wonder and the connectedness of all things that for them is more of a spiritual thing. And in a way, I find exactly that in a completely hardcore scientific naturalistic worldview. We are all connected. We are all stardust. We all return to the earth. I have this intellectual sense of awe and wonder that reality as we experience it is just mind-blowing. And it feels like such a unusual privilege to even exist and to be part of it and to have these sort of limited human capabilities to even glimpse what we're part of. So I think emotionally, I have feelings that I think are very similar to those that many religious or supernatural people
yeah, I would say I have the same thing, especially in the sense that we're all connected. And by all, I actually mean all sentient creatures.
Yeah.
Even with creatures or non-creatures who I believe are non-sentient, I feel there's, with trees or whatever, there's part of being on the earth is being part of that. But especially with sentience, it just seems to be the thing that links together. And I think of it as like a candle. Like you can, or a flame, like you can bring, flames can separate and be very many separate flames, but they also can be just one flame together. And sentience is like that in some way, that it's very individual, and we all live our lives as individuals, including animals. They all live their lives as individuals. They're not species, and they all have to go through that as individuals, but in some way there's a unity. All right, I need to stop talking about this because now I'm like getting woo-woo. But
no, but I like it. But in a way, I think you can look at sentience and consciousness in a woo sort of way, in a mystical way, and it's understandable why people do that because it's so centrally important to us. In a way, that's the only thing we know directly. Everything I'm experiencing is my experience, so it's obviously central to us, and it's quite hard to understand. So some people do take quite a mystical approach to it. Again, I think of it in a very naturalistic way. In a way, I think it's just a biologically evolved pattern of information processing that developed because it was useful for, even in the Precambrian, very simple animals to have a model of themselves, have a model of others in the environment, have a model of the environment, and to feel valenced experience that said, go towards good things and stay away from bad things. So I think that was almost the genesis, most likely, of what you and I are experiencing now. And obviously what we're experiencing is richer and more varied and bizarre in some ways.
And odd and weird.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But no, I tend to be the same, but I keep an open mind. And I like keeping an open mind because of that, what you were talking about before, the awe. And I don't think those things have to be totally separate.
Yeah.
Even if there's nothing more to it than we understand, it's still pretty awesome.
It's absolutely amazing. Yeah. And I find that just the experience of our reality as it is quite amazing enough without having to make anything up. Yeah. But I think you're right, that sort of open-mindedness has to be central, because there's a risk that even people with a naturalistic or quite a scientific and an atheistic worldview can end up sounding quite dogmatic. We have the evidence, we have the facts, we have the answer. I will brook no opposition. Dogma isn't just for the supernatural. So we need to guard against it. If we want to be proper naturalists, we need to be open-minded. But you've hinted already at the second deep question, which is what matters morally. And you've talked about how that's been an influence on your work, and you talked about that sense of connectedness and sentience as well. But in the absence of a supernatural worldview in a classical sense of, right, here's a list of commandments, or here's the Quran, or here's a deity looking over your shoulder to judge you, some people will say, okay, without that, how can you have any morality at all? What is morality? So how would you respond to that sort of challenge? What is morally good or bad, or what guides what's morally good or bad for you?
This seems like such an easy question to me, though. I'm sure it's just because I'm missing every single nuance to it. But
I suspect it's not. I think it's really easy.
I'm so perplexed when people say that. Do they seriously think that without this list of rules, which I guess they grew up in, and the rules are not bad, I'm not criticizing them, but
some of them
do they seriously think that, some of them are. Many of them are, actually. A lot of them are fine.
Yeah, the golden rule's a pretty good start.
Why would you not know the difference between, it's very Peter Singerish, but it's all about suffering. Like, not all about suffering. It's also about pleasure. But the bottom line is that if you can have a difference between a good day and a bad day, why do you have to explain what that is? It just seems so obvious to me. If you can suffer, and animals can suffer, and we don't know exactly where that line is drawn, but that's a question that's worth talking about. But whether it matters whether they suffer, it just seems so completely obvious to me. And it seems to me that it's completely obvious to most people, and they just go through a lot of convolutions to make it not obvious, that somehow there's some way around this. But it's so easy. I think one of the reasons that we do find so many ways around it is that there is so much suffering in the world. And obviously, we impose enormous quantities of suffering. But even without us, it's a pretty brutal world out there. It's one of the reasons I prefer not to believe in traditional religions, because what kind of God is this anyway? Who would think of this, that you create this planet, create these creatures who can feel things and can suffer and can be miserable and can feel terrible pain, and then set it up so they all eat each other. Who did that? I would not want to believe in that God. So yeah, I don't know what more to say about it. It just seems so simple. If you can suffer, you matter.
Well, I'm with you. So there are, of course, and again, this links back to the first topic of conversation, because people with a religious worldview will often define morality as really in a sense of compliance or obedience, which I think sort of sucks some of the value out of it. It's following this list of rules, or it's mirroring the actions of the intentions of a god or another prophet-like figure that you're supposed to replicate. So that, in a way, that becomes the definition of good, somewhat independent of suffering and flourishing, which I find odd. But the classic example is the story of Abraham, which is central to at least three of the biggest religions, where Abraham, I'm sure, felt compassion and love for his son, but because God told him to kill him, he was on the brink of doing that. And that would have been, in that worldview, a good thing to do, because ultimately what counts isn't suffering and flourishing, it's obedience to God and worshipping God. So, sorry, I'm going off on a bit of a rant there, but once you've put that supernatural view of morality to one side and you've said, okay, let's think about morality in a naturalistic way, it seems almost built into the definition of morality, just the common sense definition of morality, that it is about a concern for others. And if you're going to have a concern for others, what you mean is you have a concern for their experience and their suffering and their flourishing. So yeah, it almost becomes tautological for me. And that's partly why I think that despite the many millions of hours of philosophy and the many trillions of words written about it, the essence of it for me, as with you, I'd agree, is pretty simple. It comes back down to pleasure and flourishing and suffering, and that's pretty much it. But that links us on to the next challenging question, because I think, as you said, it's pretty intuitively strong. I think most people on the planet would agree with us, but people have radically different views about whose suffering we should care about and how far that scope of moral consideration should go. So you might argue that pre-human animals and animals today feel some form of compassion and they care about their kin or their group members, and there's some dynamics going on there about reciprocity and kin and those types of behaviors. And that was probably the genesis of early human morality as well. Our tribe, our kin, our family, caring about each other as a way, because it was evolutionary adaptable as social creatures to be able to procreate and survive. That's quite a narrow moral scope, if you like. And obviously the human species as a whole we've shifted our morality. So while many people still do have in-groups and out-groups that they prioritize, and certain out-groups of humans they completely exclude, and that leads to awful problems even today, at least conceptually, many humans have said, okay, through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, at least conceptually, we'll grant moral consideration to all humans, regardless of their characteristics. And again, we know how much that remains aspirational, right? We're nowhere near that, but at least the aspiration was set. But it'd be interesting to know your story about how you went through that moral consideration. And one of the critical points, given our discussion already, is when we go beyond the human, we start to recognize that non-human suffering matters too. And you hinted at that already in how you went through that journey. But
yeah, I'm not sure there's all that much to add to it. Reading Peter Singer was obviously what he did was, for people who were open to this thought, he just wrote it down and made it obvious. And I think people reading him who have been influenced by him, because he was the first to really write this down, and he always did it. Everything he writes is just so easy to understand, and not for a philosopher. Yeah. And so it wasn't that hard for me to get there. I just don't understand why. The thing that drives me crazy is, why did I get there and everybody doesn't get there? It doesn't seem like I went on a journey. It just seems like I woke up. Not to be self-deprecating myself, but I'm not that great a person. I know loads of people who've done much finer things in their lives than I have, who have no trouble not thinking about animals, and I know loads of people who care deeply about animals who have no trouble not thinking about how should I act in light of this information. I don't understand it. I don't think it's a philosophical problem. I think it's at best a psychological problem, and at worst just flaw in human nature, which now I'm saying, like, I've escaped this terrible flaw. It's hard to talk about this without sounding self-righteous, but as I've always said, like, how can you not sound self-righteous when you're right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
You're pretty sure you're right. And most people are pretty sure they're right. I think. Because if you weren't sure you were right, why wouldn't you change your mind? I don't get it. I don't understand why this is this big moral journey.
Yeah.
Like you just wake up to this and you think, this is terrible. The world is terrible. We're doing all these terrible things. Let's stop. And I think most of us as animal activists start out thinking, at least they used to. I guess this doesn't happen as much anymore. All I have to do is tell everybody. I found out about factory because people didn't know about factory farming then. And I found out and I was horrified. And I think everybody who got into activism at that point was pretty much thought it was a matter of information. And we still think that. And the information is important because it does change some people. But I just don't understand why it doesn't change everybody.
And you mentioned
people who are really good people and who do wonderful things in the world.
Yeah, it's deeply strange. And you mentioned that you had that one conversation where someone said, I don't eat animals because obviously it leads to their suffering and death, and that's a bad thing. And it was like a light bulb moment for you. How quickly did you manage to put that into practice? Because for some people, it's quite a long, slow, halting journey. It was for me. It took me embarrassingly long to work that through and actually make some pretty obvious changes. But did you wake up the next morning vegan, or how challenging was that transition?
I'm sure it took a long time. This was the mid-90s again. First I needed to get more information, and that was challenging enough at the time. And as I got more information, I think I became vegetarian and then very quickly vegan pretty quickly.
And what was that like socially at the time? Was it difficult socially? How weird was it?
It was more difficult than it is now in every way.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that hard.
Yeah.
I wasn't, as I mentioned, I was living alone. So that removes like 90% because a lot of the issues are within families.
Yeah.
Teenagers have such a hard time because their parents don't get it. People who are partnered have a hard time because they have different points of view, and it can be extremely divisive. Yeah. So I'm sure there's a real strong incentive to not take it that seriously. Because I just don't know how people manage that when you wake up to this and your partner doesn't. And so, the food was bad, and I'm not a good cook. And I lived in New York, in the city, and there were already vegetarian and vegan restaurants. Like, it wasn't brutally hard. And most of my friends just took it in stride, and they were used to me being set in my ways and wanting my own ways. So,
and then like, here she goes again.
They were willing to put up with that. They were willing to put up with something else. And my family's very kind and thinks I'm a little crazy, but certainly to this day, they always have something for me to eat, but it's never occurred to them that they should go there.
Yeah.
My sister and nieces and that sort of family. I don't have children myself. So yeah, I don't remember what your question was.
No, that was that was great. It was and because it's interesting in these conversations, because sometimes it feels like there's a bit of a parallel between people's journey away from a religious worldview to something more naturalistic, and one from consuming animal products towards something that's much more like veganism. Because on both fronts, and you've queued this central challenge up as we come on to talk about the future. Because on both of those topics, it seems like the answer philosophically and analytically is pretty obvious and fairly straightforward. It's almost like the arguments have been won already, but yet nearly everybody on the planet still disagrees with us either on one or both of those topics. And in a way, that's come to frame this section of the conversation I've had in these chats when we're thinking about the future, because on the one hand, it feels like there's this latent agreement that most people on the planet, at least in their day-to-day lives, do use evidence and reason in working out what to believe and how to, go about their normal daily lives. But then many people will have a supernatural or religious element that can sometimes, warp their ethics in damaging ways. Most people, most of the time, do use evidence and reason. What else would you do?
Well, can I just interrupt for a second? We use evidence and reason, but not necessarily to good ends.
Yeah, and quite often...
It's not just evidence that gets you there. It depends on what your goal is. And a lot of people's goals seem to be not so good.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's...
Yeah, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, but that's an important point, because I don't want to suggest that committing to using evidence and reason magically solves all the problems either. Because, if you pick the wrong evidence, or you warp the evidence, or your reasoning is driven by a cognitive bias, or because there's an end goal you're trying to justify. So we need to be skeptical about our own reasoning and all of the evidence we're using as well, if we're doing it right. So I totally agree. You can be thrown off course, even if theoretically you claim a commitment to evidence and reason. But then you have a similar situation on the other side where, most people on the planet, if you said, would you want to needlessly cause suffering to a sentient animal? They'd go, of course not. And
right,
yet,
exactly.
And yet,
exactly.
Right? So we're in this weird situation where most people on the planet are pretty close to agreeing with us and agreeing with our ethics, but actually their expressed behavior and their actions and their priorities are radically different. And that brings us back to, that's one of the reasons I love our hen house and the work you do with Jasmin, because it's on the one hand helping us cope with the despair that we feel about looking at the world and this frustration of these answers seem so obvious to us, but nearly everyone disagrees. And how can we handle that? But also talking to so many inspiring people that gives us hope, right? And as you say, things are so different in the places that you and I live at the moment. Anyway, things are, have never been easier to make these shifts, and you can see changes happening. I should ask a question really, but I guess that's the central challenge, right? It seems like the answers are fairly obvious, but the weirdness of human psychology and social norms and the inertia behind them seems to be more of the problem than an actual technical issue. Yeah, no, it was just an observation. So how does that leave you thinking about the future?
Yeah, it leaves me confused. I'm going through a tough time. It's been it's always been tough. Becoming aware of this and then becoming aware that people don't care in the way that you do is very painful. But right now, I just seem to ask every single guest I have on the podcast. One of my questions is always like, how do you account for the fact that people do love animals and would never do this to an animal and yet continue to eat meat? And I get loads of good answers, but none of them are good enough.
Yeah.
None of it makes sense to me. And it's not just what's going on with animals, it's what's going on with the world. I mean, with climate, with pandemic, with the insane levels of right-wing politics, and all of those things have to be connected. But one does start to despair for the future.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go there with your audience because who needs more despair in their lives? I'm trying to be honest here.
Yeah.
I ask every guest, and I'm not sure any of us have the answer. What's going on here? I would say, having been in this for a while, that things have shifted.
Yeah.
Like philosophy questions seems to have moved a little bit into the background for a lot of people. They don't need a lot of rational explanations for why we should do this, for why we should not harm animals.
It's almost as if the argument has been won in a sense already. Yeah.
Exactly. But the behavior has not followed it.
Yeah.
I guess there's a lot of argumentation right now, at least in the environmental community, about individual action. Do we each individually have to go vegan? And my goal isn't that everyone should go, well, it is that everyone should go vegan, but my bottom line goal is that animals should stop suffering. So when people say that, I just think it's a way of avoiding their personal responsibility. There's virtually no other moral issue that you would say we have to wait for laws and policy. Like if you want to abuse children, you don't keep doing it until they pass a law against it, even though you've come to the realization it's wrong. Like nothing else fits into that category.
Yeah. You wouldn't donate to a political party you opposed and say it's the system, my individual decision makes no difference. You wouldn't do that. Right? Why pay into a system that you don't need to pay into if you disagree with what that system is doing? So,
and it seems so obvious that individual veganism is part of the process. Like maybe you don't have to be actually vegan in order to live according to your own principles, but in order to make an impact on the world. But of course, there's so many ways beyond what you individually eat that you influence the world when you go vegan. Like the one thing that drives me crazy is when people say, I'm vegan at home, but when I go out, I'll have dairy. Who cares what you do? I care what you do at home, but not that much. But what you do when you're out, that's what changes the world. That's what people ripples. See. Of course. So obviously that's important. It just seems like people keep wanting to come up with excuses to do this horrifying thing that is good for nobody. And it does make me a little despairing.
And the closest I've got to an answer, and this partly through these conversations, is that I think in a way we maybe expect too much of humans, ourselves included, because in a way we are just highly evolved apes. And the morality we start from, it came from the savannah and came from a very different environment. So that's one way of mitigating our expectations of ourselves and understanding descriptively why we might have certain moral ways about us that could justify causing needless harm. The second thing, and I think this is probably the deepest, is it is really those social norms, and that even for something that clearly and very directly is obviously horrific. If your parents and your wider family and your school teachers and your society and everybody around you is telling you that this thing is completely normal to do, then it's highly likely, unless you're a somewhat unusual person, that you will disagree. And that can have really deep, powerful impact, as you said, even on otherwise brilliant intellectual thinkers, public intellectuals, philosophers, deeply moral people who still have this set of blinkers because they were taught almost from birth, this is a normal thing. And it's so hard to chip away from that.
Yeah, but then why did you? Why did are we that much better than the rest of the world, Jamie? Or what's going on? Of course, Melanie Joy's work has been I think just brilliant in this, really crystallized all of that as to why people don't go there. But what is we have to define what is the difference that made us go there? Because I don't think that we're that much better than everybody else. No. So it is possible.
I think we're just weird.
We might just really pop best. But, I don't think not. We're weird.
I don't think we're better. We're just weird.
So how do we make everybody else? Of course, they won't be weird once norms change. Unfortunately, they change too slowly. And I say it as a person who, for years, there was no hope at all.
Yeah.
And then they invented all these new products, and all of a sudden, there was just no hope at all. It was the most quixotic quest invented, and now it's not really quixotic. It's a very hard slog, but it's possible. But still, why don't they all just do it, Jamie? I don't get it.
Yeah. And it's bizarre. As you said, once you've seen it, it's very hard not to be righteous and preachy and
because we're right.
Because we are right. This isn't a trivial issue. This is a really important thing.
It's huge.
And I can imagine it. People who have a social justice cause around humans feel the same way. This is so obvious. Why can't you see this? And we just feel the same way. It's frustrating.
But when I look around and see what's happening with climate and just the horrific politics that are taking hold, and I think those two things are very deeply connected.
Yeah.
I just see the same kind of thing happening. People just call it denial, or it's not self-interest really. So it's a form of denial. Just people's ability to be in denial about what's really going around. It's probably what has allowed us to take over the world. And I just fear that it's going to be our doom.
Yeah, maybe. And I think there are cognitive themes that link some of those agendas, because I think there's an attraction to dogma, the confidence and it's a definite thing, even though if you're in your heart of hearts, it's not true, it still feels positive. There's this identitarian and tribal belonging thing, which sometimes links to the dogma, right? If you have to express the dogma to be part of the tribe, and that's more important than the truth, even if believing the dogma can be harmful. So I think there are echoes in those themes. But again, it's really weird because you flip from that frustration on all of those topics to also thinking about the more hopeful side, that you look back over history and we have managed to make some progress on some things, and sometimes that can happen quite quickly. But I guess that probably draws through to the next part of the question, which is, given your own work and the brilliant range of people you've talked to in what's your life's work, what do you think are the levers that we can most productively pull? Because you've already touched on, there's the personal choices we make, and obviously that has an impact in terms of consumption choices that runs through the economy, but there's also the wider ripples in terms of social acceptability and norms. There is what levers can we pull to drive the systemic change? Given your own work, there's the role of the law and institutions that sometimes people think following public opinion, but often they can actually lead. And then there's the practical, technical stuff as well, where can we almost sidestep the moral hard work and say, look, we're going to make the less harmful alternative so cheap and easy and fast for you that people will do the right thing anyway without a moral transition, and then maybe upgrade their morality afterwards. What's your sense about what sort of levers can we most productively pull to try and make things better? I guess primarily on the non-human animal front, but also on the human ethics challenges.
This doesn't really apply to the human ethics challenges, but I think the food obviously is crucial. I didn't always think that because there wasn't any hope on that front, but I think I just didn't allow myself to realize how dire it was. People are just not going to change their food, but the food is changing for so many different reasons. But I think that even if we achieve beyond our wildest dreams, shifting the type of food that people eat and for reasons other than the animals. And that would save billions of lives. And that would be great. But I don't think that's enough. There are many other ways in which we cause animals to suffer. And it would never motivate people to completely eliminate agriculture. it's just not enough. And we have to get the sentiment with it. But I do think that what I always say is once you get the meat out of people's ears, they can start to hear these arguments. But until you do, they just can't hear it.
Yeah.
I think Carol Adams was the person who first gave the advice, which I think is so wise. Don't have this argument at the dinner table while they're eating meat. Don't do that to yourself. It's pointless. Yeah. So I think that's the first step. I actually, maybe you wouldn't like this, but I actually think that another lever is, and this is really fortunate, is religion. Because somehow I don't know of any religion that really is wedded to abusing animals. There have in the past been a few, but even that, like not in fact, most of them have moral precepts against it, which are just ignored by virtually everybody. Christianity, not as much, but still, I think there are certainly a lot of Christian thinkers who think that it's in there and it's important. And I do think that's a lever that you and I have no ability to pull. But how can these religious people ignore this issue? It's this fundamental moral issue. And many of them are not. But many of them still are. I think that's a big lever to pull, which will be up to others to pull better than I can.
I agree. I think that's one of the things we have to do is find people where they are with the ethical systems they have and see what we can do to...
And most of those ethical systems are derived from religion.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of people.
And there's some really good work going on, both within groups within Buddhism, for example, who are saying, look, this is really obvious, right? Haven't you heard of ahimsa? Trying to make really a sentiocentric concern more obviously a central part of Buddhism, which it should be. But again, it's drifted away culturally. There's great work going on with the Animal Interfaith Alliance, for example, when there are people from Islamic faith and Christianity and various others who are looking at, again, their religious ethics and their guidance and their rules and their books and just interpreting them in a different way and saying, look, all of us share this universal compassion, or at least an aspiration to universal compassion. It should be extended beyond just our species. So in the Christian context, it's moving away from this idea of dominion, maybe to more one of stewardship and care. And you're right, there are some narrow religious practices that are explicitly drive harm to animals, but they're pretty rare. And most of all, I think there's a real rich opportunity to use that compassionate ethos and just extend that further.
Absolutely. I think I once had somebody, I can't remember his name, on the podcast talking about Islam and was telling this story, which I had never heard before, about the Prophet Muhammad. They were at war and they were fighting and they were on their way to a battle, this huge army. And he came across a dog giving birth to puppies and stationed a number of soldiers to stay there around this dog so that she wouldn't be harmed by the army moving through. At a point where he needed every soldier he could get. Like these ideas and these stories are in religion, and there are people out there who are pushing them. But I don't think it's not just changing the food. It's not just changing religion. Whatever, this is the principle from which our hen house was always based. Whatever lever you can pull or is available to you or you're good at, just work at pulling that lever. And because we need them all, we're trying to change the way the entire world works. And I think that it's happening at the same time as this crisis with the climate, which could end everything. And it has people very frightened, which is not a good thing, but it does have the advantage of also being completely keyed into this issue.
Yeah.
So I do think the opportunity is there. I just think that there's no way to pin down. We have to do everything.
Yeah.
Everything. It has to be philosophy. Some people think differently. People act differently. People find morality differently. So, yeah, it's
whatever it takes. But I like the point you made earlier on, right? Because there is a temptation that we get so frustrated with the sort of philosophical moral argument. Look, it just isn't convincing enough people. So let's switch to something that's purely about alternative products and food and just making it really easy for people. And I think that's really powerful, but we can't forget the moral argument as well, because there is a real risk we'll end up in some other really awful dead ends where there's still enormous suffering and we've just convinced ourselves, we've greenwashed or ethics washed what we're now doing, that we think it's fine. So I think we will always need that strong moral push and drive, because ultimately, as you said, what we care about is the suffering. And if we're not working on that.
Absolutely. And one of those has to be the suffering of chickens, because the climate argument isn't nearly as strong and people don't think of them as mattering. And I said to somebody the other day, I can't remember who it was, but God is a chicken, because They really deserve a little representation here. If there is a God, I hope they are a chicken. And the arguments aren't that strong. They're starting to, push chicken consumption in many countries instead of beef and grazing animals. And so, the suffering argument and the sentience argument, like, who are it's not just are they sentient or aren't they? I think that telling the stories, people have to hear who these animals are, what they can do, so that they are sympathetic to more of them. And we're the storytelling ape. That is the real way that people hear you, is if you tell a story, whether your own story or it's hard to tell the animal stories. We don't do a very good job at it.
Yeah.
I don't think we're capable of doing a very good job at it.
And we sometimes jump to just assuming they're voiceless, which is, I think, kindly meant, because it's saying, look, we have to represent them because we have to stick up for them. But it doesn't mean they're actually voiceless. They communicate and they have needs and they have interests.
It's hard. I think we've always tended to either say they're voiceless or to completely anthropomorphize them and say they're just like us. And it's neither. And it's another place in which people are asked to accept something that they don't really understand. I don't know what my dog is thinking.
Yeah.
I don't, the birds outside. I don't know. I know that there's something going on there, but I am never going to know what that is. And I think that's really frustrating for people. And it's very easy for them to go in one way or the other.
Yeah. And we're drawn to these sort of binaries where we have to be sure one way or the other. And I think it comes back to the earlier part of the conversation. True. We don't need to be 100% confident here. We just need to have enough confidence to be able to act.
I don't know that. Sorry, my Alexa just said something to you. She said, sorry, I don't know that, which seems like a good response.
We haven't come on to whether artificial intelligences can be sentient yet, but maybe Alexa wants to join the conversation.
I'm going to be dead by the time we have to deal with that problem, so I'm going to worry about it.
Fair enough. And
first, let's do the animals, and then we'll get to AI.
Exactly. One of the other things I really enjoy about IHENHAS as well is you're very clear that we need to pull all those levers, but every individual can pull levers that are within reach of them. It's not just about the personal consumption decision. We're voters, we're customers, we're shareholders, we're employees. Some people have pensions. We can write letters. There are all sorts of different ways of doing it. And to your earlier point, just sitting back and waiting for the systemic change to happen, it's crazy, right? Because all of those systems are driven by people like us in various different ways, right? So we can drive the systemic change at the same time too.
It's become such a mantra, particularly in the environmental movement.
It's defeatist.
Obviously, that you have to fight for systemic change and individual actions don't matter. But obviously, they go together. That's how change happens. People still operate individual. We all live as individuals and we operate individual to individual. And when we see an individual acting in a certain way, we can change. Of course, systemic change is immeasurably more influential than individual change. There's only so much each of us can do, but each of us can spread the word, and that's how systemic change ends up happening. And you become more passionate when you're doing things. You meet other people who are doing the same thing, and it expands your thinking and energizes you. I think individual activism of whatever kind, whether it's if you write a book, if you bring food to the office, whatever it is, it's frustrating as hell, but it's so important. And you do end up meeting really nice people.
Yeah.
The few people who agree with you and who will try your cupcakes at work, even though you told them they were vegan.
Yeah. And you can see the ripples reaching out. You can see things like, some of the initiatives, even at UN level or supranational level across the EU. You can see it at national level, governments, and just the legislation or petitions or that people are putting forward, even if they're not getting through yet. You can see it in your own field of the law in terms of the cases around personhood or challenging animal agriculture. You can just see these ripples, and it always feels too slow, but the effects are there. And you can see it in the corporate world as well. Obviously, you can see it with new companies popping up and taking advantage of the vegan dollar, but you can also see it you read these things so we don't have to, with your work on rising anxieties, as you look at the animal agriculture industry itself.
They're
and you can see the fear rise in a way, right?
They're much more frightened of us than we think is warranted. That really brings me pleasure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can see enormous change going on. And where did that come from? It came from individuals. So you really never know what your actions are going to result in.
So how does that...
Anyway, what else are you going to do with your life? Just sit here and watch it happen? At least it makes you feel like you're doing something about this. Because our audience is just grief-stricken. It's overwhelming. And we just put it aside every day. We put it aside and put it aside and put it aside, but it wears on you. So what else is the cure for that? The only thing I can think of is to try to do something about it.
Yeah.
Because we just see too much.
Yeah. And one of my previous guests said, in a way, it doesn't matter whether you're pessimistic or optimistic. Just, keep doing what you can do, keep working, and look after yourself in the meantime.
I totally agree. Because what else are you going to do?
Yeah. And it does seem there's a weird parallel in a way, because before you see this challenge that we've been talking about, there's a sort of clear cognitive dissonance that people suffer from. But it's almost like once we've seen it, we almost have to take on some deliberate cognitive dissonance almost to protect ourselves, because we've seen it, we can see the horror. We're living in a world and a culture that thinks it's completely normal. And that is quite hard to cope with. And again, that's one of the brilliant things you do in the community around our hen house. It's of course it's about compassion for all sentient beings. It's difficult, but we have to try and have compassion even for the people who don't yet see this, because we have to understand where they've come from and the context they've grown up in. It doesn't mean we can't be firm and direct and clear, but we have to at least understand them. But we also have to have compassion for ourselves and our community and look after ourselves as well. It's
not
hard.
Nice knowing this, or seeing it, and being so disparaged because of it. And of course, some of my favorite letters that we've received from our hen house are frequently from people who live in very out of the way places. One was on Niue Island right off of New Zealand, which is a country. You ever heard of? Another one was rural Saskatchewan. Imagine trying to be a vegan there, and they telling us that we're the only vegans they know. Like listening to the podcast. I think community is so important, whether you get it from a podcast or whether you're lucky enough to be able to find it in the real world, and doing things, just trying to be productive and trying to ignore how huge the problem is. And it is, I guess I am in a lucky place to the extent that I've been doing this long enough that I have seen enormous changes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the suffering continues apace and even greater. But I have seen those changes, and it seems likely that people are starting, I think they're starting to be seriously frightened. And the fact that animal agriculture does key into that, I do think that there's reason to believe that enormous changes are going to be taking place in the next 20 years. Unfortunately, many of them are going to be great. But if we could end animal agriculture, if we could take this scourge off the face of the earth, if there's any possibility that we could do it or cut it or save one animal's life, that's worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like things are shifting. Like you say, you've seen a lot of change. We need a lot more. There's much to fight for, but it's possible at least. Maybe that's all we need.
Yeah. And just the animal food world, all of these new foods, just seeing how this is just catching on. But these people have been working on it for a long time and doing that kind of preparation to be ready for the shifts. I just thank them every day. I hope they make billions and billions of dollars.
Absolutely. And I think we'll be surprised at how quickly things can change. I mean, you look back at you look back at other social change movements, and it must have felt deeply frustrating for the people trying to push those things. They always feel too slow. But you look back on it historically, and things can turn in a pretty short space of time. So let's make that happen with this one.
If there are people out there doing that prep work, and there have been. So, yeah
exactly.
We're going to end on a note of hope, aren't we, Jamie?
I think exciting. We are. Well done. Yeah, well done. But I think the hope is genuine, right? There is real despair, and it's hard psychologically, but there is proper hope there as well. And the work you're doing is absolutely central to that. So thank you so much for it. Is there anything else you want to layer into the conversation before we?
Oh gosh, no, I can't think of anything. You asked me every question possible.
Well, it was brilliant because we've decided what's real, what matters, and how to create a utopian future for all sentient beings. So that's not bad for an hour, really.
No, we just have to get everybody in the world to listen to this and say, she's so right. And so is he. That's it. Yeah, we'll just cut through. Yeah, 7.8 billion people, work in progress. But thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Yeah. What's the best way of people following you? If they don't already listen to Our Hen House and the Animal Law podcast, what's the best way of finding that? I'll put the links in, of course. But our website is very simple, ourhenhouse.org. And you can find me personally on Twitter. Social media has become a scourge of my life, and I have to get better at getting back to it. But please follow Our Hen House. You just look for Our Hen House on any of the media. And you can find the podcast wherever podcasts are listened to. Just look for our hen house.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Go sign up.
Oh, and how dare I leave it out? And the Animal Law Podcast, which is my other podcast, which comes out once a month. And in it, I interview somebody who's actually, well, usually, there's a little variation. Somebody who's actually litigating a case right now that has to do with animal law. And I always thought that only lawyers would want to listen to it, but it turns out other people seem to enjoy it as well. So I hope you check that out.
Yeah, thank you. And the law is another, fascinating lever we can pull, right? And I started out with quite a naive view that the law would follow public opinion and political opinion, but quite often the law can actually lead and be quite cutting edge. If you can get judges or courts to go back to some of the deep principles we're talking about, they can sometimes expose the cognitive dissonance and drive some quite radical change. So
that's pretty rare, JB, in my experience. But it can happen. Okay. Occasionally the law leads. It's a pretty conservative institution. And I'm probably biased as well by being in the States where the law has taken a very conservative turn over the past, since Reagan and Maggie, what a scourge upon the earth. But Steve Wise's work, look at Steve Wise's work, like in the Non-Human Rights Project. He is about to argue a case before the New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York State, one of the most prestigious courts in the country, about personhood of an elephant.
Yeah. And
he has gotten he's never won anything. I never thought he would win anything. It always seemed quixotic to me. But he's gotten amazing decisions. One from a judge on the Court of Appeals, a dissent. But so
just being heard.
That's crazy. That's just crazy. I mean, having been doing this as long as I have, that is so impressive.
Yeah. And there's some interesting stuff going on in India and a variety of different. And I get that some people will look at the personhood issue, whether it's about great apes or elephants, and go, look, that's a crazy niche. Look at farmed animals. But again, it's about sending those ripples out. It's about reminding people about sentience and about non-humans can matter. And as soon as you recognize that, you start asking the question, why not the pigs and the chickens and the cows and the fish? So again, it's just another lever, more ripples. Yeah.
It's another lever of the many. And there isn't one single one that's going to fix this. Yeah. You're not going to find the way to do this, but just pull as many as we can.
Yeah, yank them all. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to talk to you and a real pleasure. And
I would say the same.
I love both of your podcasts too. So
thank you.
I'll let you get to the rest of your day. Thanks again, Mariann.
Take care.